Good morning, Abundant Life Church. This is Pastor Chris, and today we're going to be continuing our study of the book of Romans. We'll be in chapter 2, verses 1 down through 11. We're talking about sin still. Paul is continuing to build his case that everybody has fallen short of the glory of God. Everybody needs Jesus. He started with the Gentiles. Even the ones who say they don't know God, they've never heard of Jesus. Hey, you're without excuse because everybody knows that there's something higher than ourselves. Um, he talked in the last passage about those Gentiles who've just kind of wandered so far away from the way they know they should go. They've indulged in sins like homosexuality. That's going to come up a little bit again today. But when it comes to sin, what this passage, the question that raises in my mind here is, well, there are different sins for different people. There are some sins that, frankly, you're just never going to commit. Let me give you an example for me. You are never, ever, ever going to hear this. Hey, did you hear the preacher got drunk? I hate alcohol. I hate the taste of it. Can't stand it at all. So it's not a temptation for me. In fact, years ago, my dad said to me once, he said, when you were a kid, I never worried about you drinking or doing drugs. And they said, well, Dad, is that because you saw the high moral standards that I had? He just laughed and said, no, it's because those things cost money and I know how cheap you are. Okay, Dad wasn't wrong. But the big thing is those things aren't a temptation for me. There are other things that are a temptation. We're not going to talk about those today. But those are sins I don't do. Now, Paul in this passage said that the Jews are in need of just as much grace as the Gentiles because they are guilty of committing, get how this is worded, the same sins the Gentiles were. But here's the problem. They weren't committing the same sins the Gentiles were. They were committing different sins, but not the ones the Gentiles were doing. So how could they be guilty of the same sins? What did Paul mean by this? Again, the Gentiles were involved in stuff that the Jews simply did not do. It just wasn't in them. Yet, even though Paul knew this, he still said that the Jews were doing the same thing as the Gentiles. That's what we'll look at here. All right, once again, remember the context. Paul, in the previous passage in chapter 1, had been talking about the Gentiles who chose not to follow God, and as a result, they're being led astray into sin. Their one sin in particular that Paul was focused on was homosexuality. But before he condemned the Gentiles for approving of a sin like this, he talked about what brought them to this point, where they were vulnerable to this kind of sin. To start, he said that they had no one, let me rephrase that. To start, he said, none of them could say that they didn't know there was a God, because God makes his existence obvious through his creation. But even if God was obvious to them, some Gentiles still chose not to pursue him and instead lived for their sin. All right, without godly influence, their lives would spin out of control, and they fell into the trap and the degradation of sin. And the one sin in particular that Paul mentioned was, of course, homosexuality. All right, look at verses 1 through 4 now. You therefore have no excuse. He's talking to the Jews now. He switched from the Gentiles to the Jews. You Jews have no excuse. You who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you're condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. Now we know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based on truth. So when you, a mere human being, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, do you think you'll escape God's judgment? Or do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, forbearance, and patience, not realizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? Paul points the finger at the Jews. He says, you're just as guilty as the Gentiles because you indulge in the same things. So did Paul mean here that the Jews were engaging in homosexuality as well? But the Jews didn't do that. You see, for the Roman and the Greek cultures, it was accepted practice, but not for the Jews. To them, it was an abomination. It was forbidden in their law, and they looked at it as something unnatural and something that would cut you off from the people. This is something the ungodly Gentiles do, not us. The Jews might have been guilty of a lot of things, but not this. When Spiro Agnew resigned as the vice president of the United States, he was the vice president under Nixon, and he resigned at the height of the Watergate scandal. And everybody figured, oh, well, they caught somebody in Watergate there. But the ironic thing was, Spiro Agnew was involved in a lot of criminal activities. I mean, he was, even as vice president, he was still getting kickbacks from contractors for roads in Maryland from when he was governor. He was involved in a lot of shady business, but he had nothing to do with Watergate. It was like the one thing he wasn't involved in. So you can say a lot of things about him, but you couldn't say he was guilty of anything having to do with Watergate. All right, it's the same with the Jews. You might say that they were guilty of a lot of things, but Paul, you're talking about homosexuality, and you're saying you Jews are doing the same things. Yes, the Jews could be self-righteous, they could be judgmental, but they can never be accused of saying that homosexuality was okay. So then why did Paul say the Jews were guilty, again, of the same thing as the Gentiles? If they weren't committing the same sins, what was going on here? Well, we'll talk more about that next time. Till then, have a great day.